Did you know that behind the imposing figure of Genghis Khan, one of history's most famous and fearsome conquerors, lies a series of deeds that challenge any notion of humanity? Much is said about his military genius, his ability to unite vast territories under the Mongol Empire, and even his surprising religious tolerance. Yet the most horrific chronicles are rarely discussed in detail. We are talking about the brutality inflicted upon the slaves who fell under his iron grip. These were not ordinary prisoners of war, but people reduced to mere tools of his power. These actions not only laid the foundation for an empire built on fear, but also revealed the cruel tactics that defined his rule. Human shields, a cruel war tactic. One of the most disturbing aspects of Genghis Khan's military tactics was the use of captives as human shields. This practice, which seems unimaginably cruel today, was part of his conquest strategy and evokes images that unsettle even the most seasoned readers of historical chronicles. Far from being an isolated measure, this method was employed in numerous campaigns, demonstrating the extent of his ruthless rule. As the Mongol army advanced into enemy territory, their horsemanship, archery with composite bows, and flawless tactical planning were not always sufficient. Genghis Khan, aware of the psychological impact of terror, ordered that captives be placed at the forefront of military formations. These men, torn from their homes, stripped of their identity and dignity, were forced to march at the front lines, serving as the first line of defense against enemy arrows and attacks. Rather than exposing his own army to initial losses, the great conqueror sacrificed these captives whom he deemed expendable. Although accounts are incomplete and often come from sources that sought to emphasize Mongol brutality, there are concrete examples such as in the wars against the Jin dynasty in northern China, the campaigns against the Tangut kingdom of Xixia, or during the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. The war against the Tangut kingdom of Xixia in 1226-1227, when Genghis Khan had already conquered large parts of Central Asia and was consolidating his power on China's borders, clearly illustrates this practice. According to surviving chronicles, thousands of captured Chinese soldiers and conscripted local civilians were forced to march at the forefront of Mongol formations. Without proper armor or protection, their sole role was to absorb the first volleys of arrows, spears, or projectiles from enemy fortifications, allowing Mongol troops to reach the walls with minimal risk. During the conquest of northern Chinese cities, often controlled by the Jin dynasty, the Mongols forced Chinese captives to carry battering rams or place ladders against walls without any choice. These captives absorbed the initial defensive volleys and incendiary projectiles. Once the defenders were weakened by killing their own countrymen or neighboring subjugated peoples, the Mongol elite troops launched their assault. This dynamic not only protected Genghis Khan's warriors, but also demoralized the enemy, who were forced to kill people of their own language or culture. In the war against the Khwarezmian Empire in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, the Mongols, after swiftly defeating local armies, took hundreds of captives, peasants, regular soldiers, and laborers, and forced them to march at the forefront in subsequent sieges. In extreme cases, there are documented instances where captives were tied to siege platforms or thrown over walls to spread terror and chaos in besieged cities. These extreme forms of psychological terror had a domino effect. After witnessing such macabre war tactics, many fortresses surrendered to avoid a similar fate. These actions illustrate not only calculated cruelty, but also the military logic of the Mongols, which prioritized efficiency over any moral considerations. Accounts from Chinese, Persian, and other sources from the mid-13th century remind us that behind the military exploits and organizational genius, the consolidation of history's largest empire was also underpinned by sheer ruthless brutality, forced labor, and humiliation as tools of domination. Beyond their use as human shields, enslavement under Genghis Khan's yoke encompassed a wide range of physical and psychological abuses. One of the most systematic forms of oppression was mass forced labor. Far from sporadic tasks, this labor became a fixed instrument to glorify the Mongol Empire and a humiliating reminder of the place victims occupied in the hierarchy imposed by the conqueror. Thanks to sources like the Persian chronicles of historians such as Atamalik Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, we know that Mongol armies, after conquering a city or region, selected captives based on their skills or potential utility. Those with technical knowledge, such as artisans or engineers, were forced to build siege weapons, bridges, roads, and other infrastructure projects that strengthened the empire's military logistics. Their lives were literally subordinated to the needs of Mongol expansion. Men, women, and even children could be forced to dig canals, transport supplies under extreme conditions, or construct defensive walls and watchtowers, knowing that any sign of exhaustion could be punished with execution or physical torture. Those without specialized skills were assigned the most grueling and degrading tasks. The intent was clear: to reduce them to mere tools whose only value was their physical strength. This dynamic embodied total defeat not only on the battlefield, but in every aspect of life. They were no longer just prisoners, but people transformed into commodities, forced to contribute with their own hands to the expansion of the empire that had destroyed their homes and stolen their freedom. Humiliation, however, was not limited to labor. Some sources mention bloody spectacles that, while less documented than the great military deeds, are plausible within the context of Mongol conquest atrocities. There are indications hard to verify, but repeated in various oral traditions and secondary accounts of captives forced to fight each other or face wild animals for the entertainment of high-ranking commanders. These macabre games were not unique to Genghis Khan, as the practice of using captives for violent entertainment has historical precedents in other empires. Nevertheless, their occurrence in the Mongol context underscores the degree of dehumanization achieved. The lives of captives were reduced to bargaining chips or mere amusement. This cruelty served a dual purpose. On one hand, it ensured a constant supply of labor necessary for sustaining the vast territorial expansion. On the other, it generated profound psychological terror. People knew that falling into Mongol hands meant a life of slavery, hopelessness, and systematic humiliation. Faced with this threat, many cities surrendered without a fight, facilitating the unstoppable advance of the Mongol Empire, enforcing loyalty through terror and extreme cruelty. The consolidation of Genghis Khan's power relied not only on military prowess and tactical skill, but also on the methodical use of terror to enforce unwavering loyalty. This dynamic was not limited to subjugated peoples, but extended to his own sphere of influence, including those he reduced to slaves or servants. Some historical accounts, primarily from Persian chronicles and other contemporary sources, describe extreme acts of cruelty. During the war against the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, the governor of Otrar, sometimes recorded as Inalchuk, ordered the execution of Mongol ambassadors sent by Genghis Khan, an act considered unforgivable that triggered harsh retaliation. Sources suggest that some captives were forced into morally reprehensible situations, such as executing their own relatives to prove obedience. Such acts aimed to destroy any emotional ties not directed toward the Khan. By breaking familial or ethnic bonds, he ensured complete submission to the conqueror. One of the most harrowing accounts concerns the campaign against Nishapur in Newari, 20, a city in present-day northeastern Iran. Nishapur resisted the invasion, and during the siege, an enemy projectile killed Genghis Khan's beloved son-in-law. Driven by rage and grief, the Khan ordered an exemplary destruction without distinction. This incident, documented by Persian chroniclers like Giovanni, underscores the logic of total terror, the complete annihilation of life to burn an indelible message into the collective memory. Even more disturbing sources report that the Khan forced his own daughter, the widow of the slain son-in-law, to witness the massacres, ensuring that the memory of the horror was carried forward even within his own family. This cruelty, which transcends mere martial brutality, aimed to intertwine trauma with loyalty. The message was clear: even for the conqueror's inner circle, loss, pain, and terror were tools to shape absolute obedience, making any thought of resistance or internal rebellion impossible. These acts were not mere reactions to blind rage or irrationality. Rather, they were part of a structured logic of domination, demonstrating that no personal relationship, blood tie, or life was sacred. Genghis Khan created an atmosphere of paralyzing fear. The lesson for his slaves, subjects, and allies was simple: any act of disobedience, any doubt, would bring unimaginable consequences. In this way, loyalty was cultivated not through admiration, but through fear, sexual exploitation, and dehumanization of women. The reality of slavery under Genghis Khan's rule was not limited to forced service on the battlefield or in building his empire. Among his most reprehensible acts was the systematic sexual exploitation of women captured during his military campaigns. Sources like The Secret History of the Mongols, as well as Persian and Chinese accounts, refer sometimes indirectly but certainly to this widespread practice. In the intimate sphere of conquest and the leader's inner circle, polygamy was one of the most prominent aspects of Mongol power. Genghis Khan, like many leaders of his time, solidified his rule by taking subjugated women as mere war trophies. Whether they were aristocrats from defeated dynasties, such as women from the Jin or Tangut aristocracy, or simple peasant women, they could all be reduced to unwilling concubines, objects of lust. Their origin, age, religious beliefs, or former social status hardly mattered. The only decisive factor was that they had fallen into the hands of the Mongol Empire. This pattern was not limited to the Khan himself. Genghis Khan granted his generals, sons, and allies the privilege of taking women from conquered territories, reinforcing a culture of plunder in which the dignity and autonomy of women ceased to exist. The exchange of women as part of tributes or gifts within Mongol power circles was not an exception, but a recurring practice. Through these gifts, the Khan not only consolidated his authority, but also reduced women to interchangeable pieces on the political and military chessboard. Beyond the individual level, the scale of this sexual violence left deep marks on human history. Modern historians and geneticists point out that Genghis Khan's descendants reached colossal numbers. A famous study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2003 suggests that approximately 0.5% of the current male world population, around 16 million men, can trace their paternal lineage to a common ancestor who lived about 800 years ago in the Mongol Empire's territory. The temporal and geographical alignment strongly points to a direct line to Genghis Khan. This massive spread of genes was not the result of a benign phenomenon, but the consequence of a system in which sexual dominance accompanied military and political conquest. Among the most famous descendants is Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and the product of one of his many forced unions. Kublai, who founded the Yuan dynasty in China, is a vivid example of how these practices were integrated into the structure of power and endured across generations. Every dynastic alliance, every offspring from forced unions solidified the genetic legacy while serving as a reminder of the brutal origins of these relationships. In summary, the sexual exploitation carried out by Genghis Khan and his men stripped countless women of their dignity and freedom, leaving indelible marks on human history. Terror, oppression, and utter indifference to the suffering of women form one of the darkest chapters of the Mongol rise, a reminder of the human cost that can accompany the ruthless pursuit of power. Forced migration and control through resettlement. The control Genghis Khan exerted over conquered territories was not limited to military tactics or direct psychological terror. An equally destructive and influential mechanism was the systematic practice of forced resettlement and migration of entire communities. This strategy, documented by historians like J.J. Saunders in the History of the Mongol Conquest and corroborated by chronicles like the Yuan Chronicle of the Yuan dynasty, played a key role in consolidating the Mongol Empire and employed human mobility on an unprecedented scale with extreme intensity. One of the most notable examples of this practice occurred during the conquest of Khwarezmia between Yuri 1219 and 1221. After crushing local resistance, the Mongols forced thousands of inhabitants to relocate. These populations, far from their homelands and separated from their families, were brought to Mongolia to serve as laborers or to bolster the army's auxiliary forces. This forced resettlement not only weakened the population base of conquered regions, reducing the potential for future uprisings, but also enriched the empire's human resources by ensuring a constant influx of workers and soldiers. In China, the campaigns against the Jin dynasty and later the Song dynasty involved the forced resettlement of millions of Chinese, whose presence is documented in sources like the Yuan Chronicle. These mass migrations served multiple purposes. They provided labor for infrastructure projects such as building roads, bridges, and communication systems essential for imperial logistics, and they diluted local cultural identities by mixing diverse populations under Mongol rule. The result was the deliberate fragmentation of social structures, the dissolution of traditions and collective bonds, which facilitated more effective governance and reduced the risk of organized resistance. The human cost, however, was catastrophic. The conditions during transport, poor in terms of food, shelter, and health, led to high mortality rates. Disease, starvation, and violence during the marches decimated captives, plunging communities into panic and despair. The loss of families, traditions, and cultural identity represented a profound and irreversible trauma. The forced separation of people from their homelands, also documented by travelers like Marco Polo, affected not only Central Asia and China, but also Eastern Europe, where Mongol invaders forced peasants, artisans, and prisoners of war to relocate to strategic areas. Genghis Khan's goals were clear. Through forced transport, he secured a constant supply of labor, facilitating administration and manipulation. This policy, extensively described in works like Genghis Khan, The Making of the Modern World, and The Secret History of the Mongols, by Jack Weatherford, reflects the ambivalence of Genghis Khan's organizational genius. His ability to effectively utilize human resources was inseparable from the extreme cruelty that systematically violated the rights and dignity of millions of people. Slave trade and economic exploitation. The consolidation of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan's leadership not only reshaped the political and military landscape of Eurasia, but also enabled the creation of economic dynamics that profited from the systematic oppression of millions of people. Among these dynamics, the slave trade played a central role, integrating into trade networks that connected Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe. The strengthening of trade routes both overland and along rivers under Mongol rule made the transport of goods safer, and within this transport, humans became another commodity and a constant source of income. Far from being a marginal phenomenon, the slavery driven by the Mongol Empire was part of its broader economic strategy. Historical studies, as well as Persian, Chinese, and Arabic chronicles, report how caravans carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and other raw materials also included human cargo. Prisoners of war captured during conquest campaigns, as well as forcibly relocated civilian populations, were sold in local markets along trade routes or transported to more distant regions, where the demand for slave labor was high. The Mongol trade infrastructure, which promoted safety on the routes and reduced the risk of plunder and bandit attacks, incentivized the slave trade. This relatively well-organized and secure network encouraged traders to undertake longer journeys, knowing they could transport large groups of captives without fear of losses from ambushes or minor skirmishes. In this way, the Mongol Empire not only tolerated human trafficking, but indirectly promoted it by creating an excellent foundation for its development. The impact of this dehumanization was multifaceted. First, it intensified the capture of prisoners of war, as each military campaign could yield a new group of slaves for sale. This fueled a spiral of violence. Conquests were not only aimed at territorial or political goals, but also generated human plunder with tangible market value. Thus, economic incentives intertwined with military brutality, creating a system in which human life became a commodity. Second, the slave trade promoted the cultural and social disintegration of conquered regions. Separated from their families, communities, and homeland contexts, sold individuals lost all ties that held their identities together. They were isolated in foreign lands, subjected to the commands of masters whose language and customs were alien to them. This was not only a blow to individual dignity, but also a means of atomizing the social structure of subjugated peoples. Moreover, this practice reinforced the belief that conquered populations had no value beyond their commercial utility. In the logic of the Mongol Empire, slaves were interchangeable goods comparable to camels, horses, metals, or spices. This mindset reduced humanity and undermined any notion of universal dignity. Slaves as spies and saboteurs. The versatility of Genghis Khan's and his empire's tactics was not limited to brute force or simple economic exploitation of captives. In their pursuit of maintaining and expanding control over vast Eurasian territories, the Mongols also resorted to subtler and covert methods, using their slaves as agents for espionage and sabotage. This strategy, rarely mentioned in popular chronicles, stemmed from the broader logic of Mongol rule. Every human resource, every shattered life, could be repurposed to serve the empire's needs, whether as labor, commodity, cannon fodder, or infiltrator. In a context where information was as valuable a weapon as a sword or composite bow, the ability to place informants in newly conquered or yet-to-be-conquered communities gave the Mongols an unimaginable advantage. The identities of these slaves could be carefully concealed or forged, making them perfect tools for infiltrating the social fabric of the enemy. Training in disguise, forced adoption of local languages, customs, and clothing enabled these covert agents to gather critical information, weaknesses in fortification supply routes, internal tensions, charismatic leaders vulnerable to elimination, or discontented groups that could be exploited to create internal instability. The use of slaves in this role was layered with cruelty. On one hand, they were stripped of any chance to reclaim their autonomy or original identity. A slave was not only deprived of physical freedom, but also forced to abandon their language, religion, and cultural ties to blend into the environment and serve the interests of the empire that had destroyed their world. On the other hand, the infiltrator became an element of social decay in the target community. Their presence eroded trust, fostered paranoia and fear, and sabotaged any potential organization of resistance against Mongol rule. Sabotage, often carried out by these agents, included acts like setting fire to storehouses, poisoning wells, or deliberately spreading false information to weaken and demoralize defenses. In this way, the empire could conquer not only through sieges, but also through the internal collapse of societies before a direct attack even began. Chronicles from the period, as well as modern studies like analyses of Mongol intelligence strategies, suggest that this blend of espionage and coercion was a key factor in the rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire. It was not just about brutality on open fields, but also about social manipulation through infiltration and deception. In summary, the use of slaves as spies and saboteurs highlights the ruthless ingenuity of Genghis Khan's regime. Every person under his control could be turned into a weapon, a versatile tool designed to sow chaos, fear, and mistrust. This hidden dimension of his slave policy is yet another reminder of the complex machinery of domination that solidified the largest land empire in history and the horror that accompanied the absolute instrumentalization of human life. Conclusions. When examining the pervasive forms of slavery and cruelty employed by Genghis Khan, it is easy to arrive at a one-sided image of the Mongol conqueror as a ruthless tyrant. However, the historical reality is far more complex. Genghis Khan not only accelerated the expansion of the Mongol Empire through brutality, terror, and the exploitation of millions of people, but also created a network of secure trade routes, promoted religious tolerance, and established a surprisingly efficient administrative system for his time. These contradictions make his figure a fascinating subject of historical debate. While his methods of control, including slavery, torture, cultural manipulation, and forced resettlements, were undoubtedly cruel, it is equally true that the Mongol era laid the foundation for unprecedented trade, cultural, and technological connections. Under his leadership, ties between East and West were strengthened, planting the seeds for early globalization. The invention of new forms of governance, the promotion of trade, the security of the Silk Roads, and the integration of diverse nations under an imperial framework shaped a more interconnected Eurasia. The tension between unimaginable cruelty and political innovation, between systematic oppression and integrative impulses, makes Genghis Khan a unique historical figure. His legacy cannot be reduced to a black and white image. Within the systematic violence, there are moments of ingenuity, diplomacy, and cultural openness.